died on July the 4th, 1826, which was seen by citizens in the country as a sign from Providence, or God, that these men were really unusual. And on his deathbed, Adams said, Jefferson still lives, and didn't know that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. And, they're really incredible, the intellect that both of them had, but they didn't get along, and they really fought over many things, but one of them was who was more responsible for the success of the revolution, the person who got the resolution that through the Continental Congress, or the person who drafted the Declaration.
It's an amazing chapter, an interview, and you asked Wood what he'd ask Adams, and he said, you accomplished so much. Why were you always so jealous and feeling like you weren't getting enough credit? And then you said, who'd you rather have dinner with? And he said, I'm from New England. It would have to be Adams. Next, after your amazing chapter with Annette Gordon Reed and Jefferson, is Ted Widmer on Lincoln. Widmer wrote that book on the 13 days that involved Lincoln's trip to be inaugurated, including a stop at Independence Hall, where he said, I'd rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of the Declaration. Tell us about Lincoln.
More books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than any other living American, by far. And so, you can say, why do we need to read more about Lincoln? Everybody knows everything about Lincoln. But I've read many of these books, not all of them. There are 20,000 or so books on Lincoln. But many of you have probably read the Doris Kearns Goodwin book. That was a really great book. But this book was a book by Ted Widmer, an American historian, who wrote something I didn't really know much about. It turns out that when Lincoln was getting ready to come to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated, the inauguration in those days was in March, not in January. So they would get elected in November, but there was a long period of time before you were actually president. And during that period of time, the South was getting in revolt. South Carolina seceded. Other states were getting ready to secede. And Lincoln had to deal with that. The then incumbent president, James Buchanan, didn't seem to be particularly worried about it. He didn't really want to do anything to stop it. And in fact, he probably was, supportive of slavery. Lincoln was not actually against slavery. He just didn't think it should be expanded beyond the original 13 colonies that had the right to have slavery under the Constitution. So how did Lincoln get to Washington, D.C.? Well, he couldn't take a train that would go through Kentucky or other southern states. That would be a more direct route, but he was afraid that he could be assassinated there because these were Confederate states, or about to be Confederate states. So he took a very circuitous route, went through the north, and he actually went to 60 different cities. And he made a speech in every city. Remember, people had never seen him before. He was a relatively unknown person. He had only been in Congress for 2 years, and he really had never been governor, never been a senator. And so people didn't know what he looked like. People had never heard him. They didn't have television in those days. So he was using it as an opportunity to get to know people and give his views. And he made 60 different speeches. And he made maybe his most famous one at Independence Hall. And then it turned out that there was a plot to kill him. It was in my hometown of Baltimore. And so therefore he cleverly used a Mr. Pinkerton, who was a guard then, later created the Pinkerton Agency, to help him move a train, get into a different train that was expected. And he got through Baltimore. But he came into Washington. People had said dressed as a woman. That wasn't true, but he was disguised a bit, and he came in and he went to the hotel and stayed in the hotel for about 10 days before he was inaugurated. It was incredible when you think about it. And as great as Lincoln was, he said in his inaugural address, he did not want to get rid of slavery. He was in favor of an amendment to the Constitution that would have reaffirmed slavery in the original states. But later, he became the great president that he became by winning the revolution, the Civil War. And remember, a lot of times in those days, a lot of people in the North, in Philadelphia and other places said, look, the South wants us to secede, let them go. We don't need them. We can be a great country without them. Lincoln didn't believe that. He wanted to keep the country together, so he fought to keep it together, and he eventually realized that one of the best ways to win the war was to free the slaves, and he did that, and through the Emancipation Proclamation, and then eventually 200,000 freed slaves fought for the Union, though in segregated army units. And I think Lincoln deserves more credit than any other person who's president for the country we have now, because had Lincoln not done what he done and other people in the North been president, they would have probably let the South go away. It would have been two separate countries. We wouldn't have become the country that we became. Lincoln also had a certain humility about him. He didn't say, I won the Civil War. I just won the Battle of Gettysburg. Don't I deserve, pat me on the back. He never said that. He was a very humble person, self-deprecating humor. He also had, although he had no education to speak of, he could write the English language better than anybody we've ever seen, possibly except for Shakespeare. And so when you think about it, he wrote 272 words for the Gettysburg Address. He spoke for 2 minutes there, and those 272 words are the most eloquent statement about what this country's all about that anybody has ever written, before then or since then. And he did it, by himself. He didn't have a speechwriter. He didn't have a team of speechwriters. He didn't have ghostwriters. It's incredible. The second inaugural address, the most eloquent inaugural address probably of all time, was written by him himself. So an incredible person. And it's tragic that he died at the age of 56. And he died in part for two reasons that I'll just mention. He had a difficult relationship with his wife. She was complicated, let's say it that way. And a couple days before the assassination, Lincoln was in Northern Virginia inspecting the victory that they'd had in the Richmond area in Northern Virginia. And with him was Ulysses S. Grant, who was the victorious general, and some other generals. And at one point, Lincoln is riding on a horse. They didn't have they didn't have anything other than to get by on horses. He's riding on a horse, and for one short period of time, another general's wife, an attractive young woman who was married to another general in the North, happened to be riding alongside him. Mrs. Lincoln got jealous, and she yelled at this woman and got in a big argument. Well, Mrs. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's wife, was there and saw this and said, I don't want anything to do with Mrs. Lincoln. So on the night of, I think it was April 14th, Lincoln invited Ulysses S. Grant to accompany him to Ford's Theater. And he asked his wife, well, guess what? The president wants us to go to the theater with him. She said, no, I don't want to see Mrs. Lincoln. I don't want to be with her. We got to find an excuse. So they made an excuse that they had to go to New Jersey to visit their son. So they took a train to New Jersey. Had they gone to Ford's Theater, the military entourage around Ulysses S. Grant would have certainly prevented John Wilkes Booth from getting close to Lincoln. But Lincoln had no guards with him that night. He had one aide with him, a young man, and almost certainly that aide was unable to stop John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth decided to assassinate Lincoln. He'd always been a slave defender, but Lincoln, after the 13th Amendment was agreed to by the House and ready to go to the ratification, it was agreed to. It was a great victory for people that wanted to end slavery. You had the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to certain states, and it really wasn't the law of the land quite the way the Constitutional Amendment would be. So you needed the 13th Amendment. After the 13th Amendment was approved by the Congress before the ratification, people came to the White House and said, we want a speech, Mr. Lincoln. Tell us about it. And he came out and he made a little speech, and he was asked a question about what should freed slaves be able to vote. And he said something to the effect that if they are educated and appropriate and so forth, they might be able to have the right to vote in certain areas. That John Wilkes Booth was there. He heard that, and he said, no voting for former slaves. And he was so incensed that he went ahead with his plot to go ahead and assassinate Lincoln. Lincoln died at the age of 56. Had he lived, Reconstruction probably would have worked better. His successor, Andrew Johnson, wasn't really in favor of Lincoln's programs on Reconstruction. Reconstruction backfired and led to all the Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan and so forth. Had Lincoln lived, the country would have been much better off.
That's such a crucial detail, that it was Lincoln's embrace of the right to vote that led to his assassination, and then you show how that was the centerpiece of Reconstruction and Grant's commitment, in at least the beginning, to black voting rights, ultimately subverted by the Compromise of 1876. Your Grant chapter is great. It's with the great Ron Chernow. We learned from that interview that Ron Chernow learned his craft from being a journalist and as well as an English major, and that's how he could tell those great stories. And he also tells us about Grant's alcoholism. He wasn't drunk all the time, but he'd go on benders. Tell us about Chernow and Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant was a person who didn't really want to go to be in the military, but his father had a tannery, and when he was growing up, he had to smell the effects of the tannery all the time, and it kind of made him sick, and he just couldn't want to be around that. He didn't want to be in his father's business. His father got him an appointment to the military academy, and Grant went, but he kept thinking that there was legislation in Congress to get rid of the military academy. He kept hoping that legislation would pass so that they could get rid of the military academy. But he went there in the middle of his class, not a great student particularly, fought in the Mexican-American War with Robert E. Lee on the same side that they didn't really know each other. And then Ulysses S. Grant had an alcohol problem. And so when he was out west doing some military things, basically the Army caught him being drunk when he was supposed to be on duty. So he basically given the chance to resign or be kicked out or court-martialed, so he resigned. He then goes back to his hometown and tries to find some jobs. He can't go in the tannery business. He didn't want to work for his father. He tried to work for his brothers. That didn't work out. Finally, he gets some land from his father-in-law, and he's working the land, and he's basically chopping wood. And he's going near St. Louis. So he chops firewood, and he goes into St. Louis every day to sell firewood. So he's on the street corners of St. Louis selling firewood to make money for his family. And 8 years later, he's elected President of the United States. Hard to believe. So incredible comeback story. But what happened was when the war broke out, because he had some military experience, he got involved in the militia in Illinois. Eventually, he was successful. Lincoln heard about him. He won some battles. He won more and more battles. Every other general that Lincoln had was not very successful. But Lincoln, when he kept appointing this general, people said to him, well, he's an alcoholic. And Lincoln said, well, find out what he's drinking and let's give it to the other generals because he was such a good soldier. And so eventually, we won the war in part because of Grant. And then later was elected president of the United States, served 2 terms, a lot of chicanery and I would say things that were done, financial improprieties, not by him, but people around him. And he ultimately finished 2 terms and was very successful. And then he left the country for a year and went on a tour around the world, which was very unusual for a president to do that. Came back, got into business, put all of his money into his son's business. It went bankrupt, and ultimately Grant had to figure out how to make money for his family. He was broke, completely broke, and he had to borrow money from one of the Vanderbilts, and he wasn't sure he could ever pay it back. So ultimately, he was persuaded by a person named Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, to write his memoirs. And he wrote his memoirs by himself, and they were considered the greatest presidential memoirs of all time. And he finished them just as he died of throat cancer. He'd smoked about 15 or 20 cigars a day. That he got throat cancer was probably not a big surprise. So any of you ever remember the famous show on television, You Bet Your Life, with Groucho Marx? Any of you old enough to remember this? And he always would say to people, who was buried in Grant's tomb? Well, actually, it's Grant. And it was an elaborate in New York area. That's where Grant is buried. And he actually became president at 46, served 8 years, and died very, very young. But an incredible person in many ways, a great general, sometimes a better general than a president.
And Chernow describes that moment where he saw the originals of the memoir, proving that Grant actually wrote it himself.
Right. So let me just add one thing about Grant. Grant's wife had a certain problem with her eye. It was kind of what I would call a wandering eye, if any of you know what that is. The eye doesn't look directly at you. And when Grant was away one time on military things, his wife went to a doctor and said, can I fix this eye? Can you fix the eye so that I can look straight ahead and have a normal eye? And he said, I think I can do it. So when Grant came back, one time his wife said, guess what? I think I can fix my eye. And he said, I'm very upset with you. Why do you go talk to a doctor? I married you with the eye that you have. I don't want you to have a different eye. I love you as you are, and I don't want a different eye. So a credible bit of romance, I guess, from Ulysses S. Grant. His wife never got the operation again.
No, it's a beautiful story. It really conveys the intensity of their relationship and called to mind Woodrow Wilson's unexpectedly passionate love letters to his second wife. But let's keep going in order because this is just so great to hear all these stories. Amity Shlaes makes a revisionist case for Coolidge, who, as you note, has become a kind of hero among conservatives now for cutting capital gains tax and disciplining the budget and restoring federalism. Were you persuaded by her case for Coolidge? And tell us about Coolidge.
Coolidge was a person who went to Amherst, was a New England person who was very flinty, very cheap, didn't like to talk very much, not a particularly great student or anything. But he got elected to some local jobs and eventually got elected governor of Massachusetts. And there was a police strike at the time, and he famously said, there is no right of the police to strike against the public at any time. That statement went around the country, and all of a sudden Coolidge became a hero because he broke the police strike. And so when Harding was looking for a vice president, he picked Coolidge. And Coolidge took the job. He'd only been governor a short period of time, but he was pretty well known for that one statement. And then Harding died of a heart attack, and Coolidge became president. And he really hadn't wanted to be president. Most people become president actually want to be president. He didn't really want to be president. And he was very laconic, and he doesn't like to talk very much, and he wasn't like to brag about himself. He never would be boastful, very flinty New Englander. And so one woman went to him and said, I have a bet with my friend that I can get you to say more than 2 words. And he said, you lose. He did run for re-election, and he won. He could have run for another term, but he chose not to do so, and he allowed his Secretary of Commerce to run it. That was Herbert Hoover. Coolidge was a person who just didn't seek the limelight. Most people who become president of the United States like the limelight. That's why they got the job, or that's how they got there. Coolidge really didn't want to do it, but he was loved by the conservatives today. And Reagan put his portrait in the cabinet room because Coolidge was in favor of balancing the budget. A balanced budget in the United States is when you actually have more money come